While playing through either of the Left 4 Dead games, have you ever taken a moment to stop and look around? One specific detail always jumps out at me. As we're making our way through destroyed cities, abandoned hospitals, swamps, carnivals, and evac center after evac center, why do we see such a small number of soldiers? The green flu is a battle between humanity and the most destructive virus our species has ever seen. But the best the US government can do is a few jets, Humvees, and the occasional infantryman? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, does it? You're right. On the surface, it seems like the US military and government just abandoned half of their country without much of a fight. But when we dive a little bit deeper, we can see how it connects to the bigger picture that is the US military's strategy against the green flu. But first, let me set the stage. The year is 2009. The US is in a time of relative stability, recovering from an economic recession in 2008, and their armed forces are dealing with some conflicts around the world, such as the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, which are both part of the broader War on Terror. This means that portions of the military are deployed overseas. In January 2009, there were approximately 177,000 US troops deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, with about 144,000 in Iraq and 33,000 in Afghanistan. These figures represent the personnel deployed in the operations, not the entirety of the US military, which comprised 1,400,000 personnel at the time. But this still doesn't explain the massive disparity of combat personnel we see in the Left 4 Dead games, so what does? The green flu strikes in October 2009, and it strikes incredibly quickly. By the time it's established as a threat, it has already spread and contaminated around 1/4 of the United States. The military doesn't have time to deploy forces to contain the threat at its point of origin, and they realize this. So what do? As we've established in my previous video, the military is attempting to sacrifice a massive part of the eastern US by destroying meaningful infrastructure in an effort to preserve the western US. I think that they knew that sending infantry forces straight into the heart of the infection was a lost cause, and would ultimately yield less than satisfactory results. But what about the infantry that were already there? My theory is that they activated National Guardsmen, and that is what we see throughout the Left 4 Dead games. This would explain why their equipment is so outdated, even for 2009. The National Guard is mostly used as a force to maintain order and help the US recover from disasters, both natural and man-made. They can be activated in times of turmoil and societal unrest. The president can take command of the National Guard during martial law, which was most likely one of the first things enacted at the beginning of the green flu pandemic. But before we get into martial law and its grander implications for the universe of Left 4 Dead, let's take a look at some of the equipment shown in the Left 4 Dead games and break down where it came from. Now, here's the real giveaway that we're mostly looking at the National Guard in Left 4 Dead, the equipment. A lot of what we see is seriously outdated even for 2009. For example, the M35 Deuce and a Half trucks were phased out in the 80s, and the UH-1 Huey was replaced by the Black Hawk back in the 70s. Yet in Left 4 Dead, they're everywhere. That's not frontline army gear, that's guard surplus pulled out of storage. The same goes for the small arms weapons. The M16A2 shows up even though most active troops by 2009 had moved on to M16A4s or M4 carbines. We even see things like the M60 machine gun and the M79 grenade launcher, both of which had been retired decades earlier. The fact that survivors can still find them lying around says a lot about the kind of desperate scrape-the-barrel response happening on the ground. And then there are the oddities like the MAC-10 and the MP5, which weren't even standard military weapons at that point. Those were mostly law enforcement or special unit firearms, meaning the Guard was likely pulling from state and local stockpiles just to get people armed. Now, compare that to the modern equipment we do see, such as the FA-18 Super Hornets dropping bombs, the C-130s handling transport, and CH-53 heavy lift helicopters supporting evacuations. Those are active duty assets and they're being used strategically, at a distance. Meanwhile, the boots on the ground presence is mostly guardsmen with whatever leftover gear they could get their hands on. So when you put it all together, it makes perfect sense. The US didn't abandon the fight. They just didn't commit the full weight of the US Army. They mobilized the Guard, armed them with what they had, and relied on air power and containment instead of sending modern infantry straight into the meat grinder. And here's the kicker. The National Guard probably didn't even realize they were pawns. Their real purpose wasn't to win battles, it was to buy time. Time for the regular military to cut off the East from the West, by blowing bridges, torching cities, and destroying every major route of escape. The Guard thought they were saving people. In reality, they were being set up for failure. And you can see it all throughout Left 4 Dead 1 and Left 4 Dead 2. Evacuation after evacuation collapses. Safe zone after safe zone gets overrun. So how does that benefit the US military? It's pretty simple. Optics. To the average civilian watching the news, it looked like the government was doing everything it could to save lives. But the truth is, the military already knew those zones would fall. They knew outdated Humvees and M16s weren't stopping millions of infected. That was never the plan. The National Guard were simply meant to lose. The only time we actually see the full weight of the US military is in the Parish. And the difference is night and day. Suddenly the broken down Humvees are replaced with armored vehicles. The M16s are swapped out for FN Scar Ls, and the old Hueys are upgraded to CH-53 Sea Stallions or Pavlos. FA-18s scream overhead, dropping bombs across the city. For the first time, we're not just looking at reservists, we're looking at the real US military machine. And there's another small but important detail: pipe bombs. Scattered all around military equipment in the Parish. That means the regular forces knew the infected were drawn to sound, but chose not to share that information earlier. Was it to prevent panic, or was it to make sure those doomed safe zones fell even faster? We'll never know. And if you need more proof that this was a bait and delay strategy, just look at where the supposed safe zones are located. Riverside in Death Toll is literally a dead end. Sure, the river protects one flank, but it also traps the military the second they're surrounded. That's not the kind of decision made by the most powerful army in the world. That's the kind of call made by reservists and local guardsmen with no real-world training. Then in Dead Air, the military isn't even pretending to save people. They're firebombing the city with thermobaric bombs. These things burn hotter than 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. They don't just destroy buildings, they melt the oxygen in the air. That's not just about killing the infected, that's about erasing everything. People, evidence, and information. And it goes even deeper. Remember the plane that crashes during Dead Air's finale? A Boeing 737, ripped apart in midair before it even hits the ground. That's a commercial airliner flying at a cruising altitude of over 30,000 feet. The infected aren't capable of that. The only thing that can rip apart a plane at that altitude? The same F-18 fighter jets we see in the Parish. In other words, the US military wasn't just bombing cities, they were shooting down civilians trying to escape. So while the National Guard thought they were fighting to save lives, the truth is brutal. The higher-ups never intended for them to succeed. They were pawns in a bigger strategy, used as bait to hold the line while the real military quietly sealed off the country. And this is where it all comes together. As survivors, we're not just fighting the infected, we're walking through the aftermath of the government's real plan. Every so-called safe zone we stumble into, every evac center left abandoned, Every Humvee left rusting in the street tells the same story. The National Guard was never meant to win. They were bait. The civilians were expendable, and the survivors are stuck in the middle of a cover-up that was never supposed to see the light of day. But this wasn't just about containing the infection, it was about controlling the narrative. Think about it. The government enacts martial law, activates the National Guard, and fills the news cycle with stories of evacuations and brave last stands. To the average person watching from outside the hot zones, it looks like the military is doing everything they can to save lives. But inside the quarantine, survivors like the ones we play as in Left 4 Dead see the truth. The safe zones aren't safe, the soldiers aren't equipped to hold them, and the rescue missions are little more than delaying tactics until the bombs drop. That's why Left 4 Dead never feels like a story about winning. It's a story about surviving just long enough to realize you've been abandoned. Not by the infected, but by the people you thought were supposed to save you. If you need any more evidence, look no further than Rochelle's backstory. One of the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rochelle was a field producer for Eyewitness 10 News. She was sent to Savannah to cover the story on the evacuation centers and this mysterious virus spreading across the East Coast. But here's the thing. Even she was misinformed by her own network. Despite literally being there to report on the outbreak, Rochelle has no idea what the infected really are. Her dialogue during Dead Center makes it clear she doesn't understand the green flu turns people into these violent, rage-driven monsters. That's not ignorance on her part, that's intentional misdirection. Either the media itself didn't know, or more likely, they were feeding the public and their own reporters a carefully controlled narrative. Rochelle shows us exactly what the military wanted civilians to see: stories of evacuations, containment, and order, while hiding the reality of what was actually happening inside the quarantine zones. When you put all of this together, the picture becomes clear. The US military never fully committed to saving civilians from the green flu. Instead, they activated the National Guard, armed them with outdated equipment, and set them up to fail. Not as a mistake, but as part of a strategy. Their role wasn't to win, it was to buy time while the real military quietly cut off the infected east from the rest of the country. That's why the survivors in Left 4 Dead never find true safety. Every evac center, every safe zone, every rescue attempt was doomed before it even began. The infected may be terrifying, but the bigger horror is realizing that the people who were supposed to protect you never had any intention of doing so. In the end, Left 4 Dead isn't just about surviving a zombie outbreak. It's about surviving the lies, the cover-ups, and the abandonment of a government willing to sacrifice millions for the so-called greater good. Maybe the real apocalypse in Left 4 Dead wasn't the green flu at all. It was realizing we were never meant to be saved.